Right. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the third edition of our Harvesting Solutions webinar series. Harvesting Solutions was developed by the Minnesota Farm Bureau as an opportunity to bring our members together to talk about some of the challenges Minnesotans are facing and try to brainstorm ways that Farm Bureau can be a part of building connections and finding solutions. Our first two webinars focused on childcare and healthcare, and you can find the recording of those episodes on our website under the Harvesting Solutions page or on our YouTube channel. In today's episode, we are going to be covering labor issues facing the state. We will have two guest speakers, Cameron Mach with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, who will discuss labor force and economic trends in Minnesota, and Mike Miron, who's a teacher in the Forest Lake area, who will talk about his school's program to introduce students to real-world learning opportunities and career paths. And we will also have time at the end of both presentations and at the end of the program for any questions. So to start us off today, I'd like to introduce Cameron. He is the Regional Analysis and Outreach Manager at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, supervising a team of 5 regional analysts that provide labor market information to support workforce and economic development efforts across the state. He has over 20 years of experience working in Deed's Labor Market Information Office, as well as prior career practice in marketing, market research, and economic development. He has a bachelor's degree in organizational management and marketing from the University of Minnesota Duluth. Welcome, Cameron, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Am I able to share my screen so I can put up awesome. Let me do that real quickly here, sorry. All right, and are you able to see my PowerPoint presentation? Awesome. So thank you so much for this opportunity to join you. I've got a lot of information, but just want to let you know this is really just scratching the surface of what we have available through our office. Hopefully you guys will be familiar with the team that I'll show you on the last slide that I'm sharing. And I am hoping that Mike will know Tim O'Neill. He's our Twin Cities regional analyst, and I know he's done a lot of work with Forest Lake area high school. So my goal in the short time that we have together is just to kind of give a broad overview of how the state's demographics are changing, how the labor force is changing, what that means for businesses across the state. With that, I'll try and keep it a little bit interactive. And so I'll ask you guys some questions. You certainly can ask me questions as well. And if you have any follow-up or additional things you want to know about after this presentation, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help. The whole team is also happy to help in lots of different ways. Okay, so let's see here. So my first question that I have for the people who are on the call, and the reason I do this is it's helpful to set context for everyone, make sure we're all kind of on the same page. Sometimes people have different perceptions of what the situation that we're in, and usually sharing actual numbers can be really helpful in aiming people in the right direction, making sure that we're all working off of the same page. So does anybody have a guess? Like what do you think Minnesota's population currently is? How many people live in the state of Minnesota? Since we're not together, I don't have a prize that I can give you, unfortunately. And it's kind of like The Price is Right. You don't want to go over, right? And I apologize because I can't see the chat. So if anybody's typing it in the chat, then I'm just out of luck. So doesn't seem like I'm getting a lot of guesses in, but if anybody is guessing, if you guessed close to 5.8 million, you're doing pretty well. Minnesota's population is in 2023, which is the most recent estimate available, we had 5,737,915 people. Now, is that more or less people than we had in 2020? So is Minnesota's population growing or declining?
I think it's declining.
Excellent. That's a good guess. Does anybody in the room think that it might be growing?
I think we had a few more, but not many.
Yep. So Marvin is correct. We have seen some growth, but it's been much slower growth these last couple of years. So obviously, the pandemic had something to do with that. We saw a lot less inflow and outflow during that time period, but the state's population is still growing. And if you look longer term, the state's population has been seeing really pretty steady and strong growth, especially as a Midwestern state. We're up from about 5.3 million people back in 2010 and up significantly from about 3.8 million people back in 1970. So over the last 50 years, added almost 2 million new residents during that time frame. Now, if you look at those 5.7 million people in the state of Minnesota, do you think that a higher percentage are children, so under 18 years of age, or senior citizens age 65 years and over? What do you think is the larger percentage of the population? Anybody want to take a guess at that?
I think it's about 50-50. I mean, even.
Yeah, close to the same size. Yep. Anybody else want to take a guess? So this is an area where we actually have some good news. The young population is still larger than the state's older population, but that is changing over time. We have seen a pretty significant uptick in the number of people aged 65 years and over. And with the back end of the baby boom generation, we'll see that trend continuing over the next 10 or 20 years here as well. So in the state, about 1.3 million people that were under 18 years of age, compared to about 1 million people that were 65 years and over. So now the Twin Cities metro area, as a metropolitan statistical area, it's actually like 16 counties. But when we break it out as a region in the state of Minnesota, we say there are 7 primary counties. So Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Scott, Ramsey, and Washington. The other 80 counties in the state are then considered greater Minnesota. So of the state's 5.7 million people, how many do you think live outside of the 7-county Twin Cities metro area?
I think it's...
This one's a little tougher, right? Because there are still some metro areas in greater Minnesota. We've got Rochester and St. Cloud and Duluth and Mankato and all these other areas. So there's actually about 2.6 million people that live outside of the 7-county Twin Cities metro area. But the vast majority of the state's population is living in that Twin Cities metro area. And a lot of the people who live in that metro fringe also are commuting into or have jobs that are located in the Twin Cities metro area. But really, there's a significant number of people who live in greater Minnesota. That's actually where I live. If you guys are familiar with Willmar, I live in a small town just west of Willmar, and all of the regional analysts that are serving the greater Minnesota regions are also located outside of the Twin Cities metro area. Okay, so final question that I have for you here on this slide is, of those 5.7 million people, how many do you think are actively participating in the labor force, meaning they either have a job or they're actively seeking a job? So out of 5.7 million people, how many do you think are working and are
Well, if you take 2,000 away, 3,000 away.
Yeah, it seems like you're kind of heading in the right direction there, Juanita. We actually have just over three. Yeah. So we got about 3.1 million workers in the state of Minnesota in July of 2024. Now, what might be surprising is that number has actually been declining. So if you compare the number of workers that we have now compared to February of 2020, which was the month right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the state of Minnesota has actually seen a slight decline in the overall labor force during that time frame. Again, and if you're comparing the state of Minnesota as a whole, the Twin Cities metro area and greater Minnesota has about 1.4 million workers. Now, what's interesting is that the number of workers has actually gone up slightly in greater Minnesota compared to a slight decline in the Twin Cities metro area. So we get this question quite often. This is a pretty hot topic right now, is where are the workers? And sometimes what we'll hear back from businesses is they will tell us that workers are disappearing because nobody wants to work anymore. And that certainly can be an argument that people can put forward, but what we've seen is that it's an argument that has some staying power. This is actually from a website called Snopes.com. They do some fact checking on different things that happen across the internet. And they compiled this list of different newspaper articles and things from the last century, talking about how nobody wants to work anymore. So it's not a new phenomenon, this idea that the reason we can't find enough workers is because nobody wants to work. But it does feel more acute, especially since the pandemic, right? It is a bit more challenging to find enough workers to fill the jobs that we have. So what's interesting is if you actually look at the state of Minnesota's labor force and how things have changed over time. So just the last 50 years, the state of Minnesota has added a tremendous amount of population, but also then a tremendous amount of workers. So between 1976 and 2019, we added almost 1.3 million new workers. But what's kind of crazy, what's interesting about that number is we actually have fewer unemployed workers now than we had back in 1976. So essentially what's happened is everyone that's come into the labor force over that time frame has been able to get a job. Now, I'm not saying that it's the same people from 1976 who are still in the labor force now, although there might still be some people in that situation, but it's just reflecting that Minnesota's economic engine has been roaring for the last 50 years, and there's been tremendous opportunity. Everybody who's been able to come into the labor force has been able to find a job. Now, again, we did see a pretty substantial shift in the labor market during the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a short recession, lasted a couple months, but we're still seeing lingering effects from that. And we have a slightly smaller labor force now than we had prior to going into that. We have seen a rebound in these past 2 years, but again, the unemployment rate, the actual number of unemployed workers, if you're comparing 2023 versus 1976, we actually have fewer unemployed workers now than we had 50 years ago, even though we've added almost 1.3 million new workers during that time frame. So actually just this morning, we did a press release for the state's unemployment rate for July of 2024. So this is absolutely the most current information available. It was just released about 2 hours ago. The state's unemployment rate is now 3.2%. Which has been going up. So our unemployment rate has been increasing the past couple months, but it's still significantly below what most economists will say is a full employment level, which is around 4%. And it's also significantly lower than the US rate, which is about 4.3% right now. And the US rate has also been increasing in recent months. We actually had an all-time low of 1.9% in November of 2023. So this tight labor market has been with us for quite some time. Again, the number of unemployed workers then, as the rate has been ticking upward, has also been rising, but it's still below levels that we were seeing 50 years ago when we had far fewer workers. There was a brief peak that we reached back in May of 2020, which was early COVID pandemic, when a lot of businesses had changed their method of operation. Some of them were closed temporarily or were laying off workers temporarily. But it's getting closer to the level that we were at when we went into the pandemic recession. So back in February of 2020, we had about 110,000 unemployed workers. We're still below that level, but you can see that we are getting closer to that level of labor market tightness. Overall, again, we've got about 3.1 million total workers. That is an increase compared to 2021 and 2022. But we're still down about 35,000 workers in comparison to pre-pandemic levels. And that's what's creating some of the struggle in finding available workers. The reason that it sticks out so much is that in the state of Minnesota as a whole, there's a federal program called Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or called JOLTS. And they provide an estimate of the number of job openings in the state of Minnesota and for all states in the US. And in May of 2024, which is the most current available, Minnesota had about 169,000 job openings. And so again, if you compare that to the number of unemployed workers that we're talking about, so a couple months ago, we had I think around 85,000 unemployed workers in the state. It works out to about 2 jobs for every one person that's actively seeking a job. Well, you can understand better than why employers might be saying they're having a hard time finding workers if there aren't enough available workers to fill all of the jobs that are currently posted. Again, this is part of a longer term trend. So if you look at the state's labor force growth on an annual basis between 1990 and 2023, during the 1990s, the state of Minnesota was seeing tremendous employment and labor force growth. We were averaging about 41,400 new workers per year. Some years it was faster than that, some years a little bit slower, but over that decade, we added more than 400,000 new workers. Then during the 2000s, we actually had two separate recessions. The 2001 recession was pretty minor. The 2008 recession was pretty significant. It actually was called the Great Recession. Minnesota's labor force growth slowed down significantly. During that time frame, we only added about 128,000 net new workers during that decade. And then finally, the 2010s, we saw pretty significant economic expansion. In fact, it was the longest running economic expansion in modern history up until 2020. And we gained about 193,000 net new workers during that decade. If you compare that to greater Minnesota as a whole, same deal here. We're seeing a slowdown in labor force growth over each decade. So the numbers had been halved between 1990 and the 2000s. And we also can do labor force projections. So what do we expect to see happen in the future? The Minnesota State Demographic Center does population projections by age group, looking out into the future, actually all the way through like 2065, or they might even have 2075 at this point. But just looking in the near term, so between 2025 and 2035, if we use those population projections by age group and then apply current labor force participation rates by age group, we can come up with a guess for how many workers we think are going to be in each of these age groups during these time periods. And if current trends continue, we would expect to add about 95,000 new workers over the next 10-year period. So that's, again, a pretty significant slowdown in comparison to the growth that we were seeing in past decades. It was much easier for employers to expand when they had access to a deep and growing talent pool. It's also important to point out that half of the state's labor force growth between 2010 and 2020 was from foreign-born residents, people who had moved into Minnesota from some other country. That's been a tremendous boom for Minnesota's labor force over the last couple decades. And the labor force growth is not expected to be equal across the entire state of Minnesota. The Twin Cities is expected to see over half of the state's labor force growth in the next decade. And the fastest growing regions of the state include central Minnesota, which might add about 24,000 new workers. Southeast and northwest Minnesota, both expected to add a little over 10,000 new workers during that time frame. Southwest, which is expected to grow just a little bit, about 2,300 new workers. And then Northeast, which has actually already reached kind of the tipping point, and a larger percentage of their population is 65 years and over and reaching retirement age and dropping out. So Northeast is expected to see a slight labor force decline next decade. And this is important because if you look at how labor force grows, you need to have more people coming in, or you can change the participation rates by age group. And you can see in Minnesota, we actually saw teenagers coming into the labor force in large numbers during the pandemic recession. And thankfully for teenagers, we were able to fill a lot of the jobs that were open. So we actually saw labor force participation rates go up for younger age groups. But our aging population is really a bigger factor that's holding back labor force growth overall, especially in comparison to some of our neighboring states. If you break down the size of the population and the number of people who are actively participating in the labor force in Minnesota, pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, you can see what the significant change is. We just have a large percentage of our population that's aging into the 65-year and over cohort, which tends to have much lower labor force participation rates overall. And the other factor that has exacerbated that change is that the labor force participation rate for people 65 and over has actually been declining since 2019, after it had been rising in the previous decade. Minnesota's labor force is also going to become more racially diverse over time. So between 2010 and 2022, the state's white labor force actually declined in size, primarily due to the aging population. But the state's size of the labor force and participation rates actually were increasing for every other race group, excluding American Indian and Alaska Natives over the last decade. So the state's labor force growth has primarily been occurring from people of other races, including Black or African Americans, Asian or other Pacific Islanders, people of some other race or two or more races. And also the state has seen tremendous growth in the Hispanic or Latino labor force, grew by almost 50,000 workers during this past decade. The state has also seen a tremendous amount of growth in foreign-born workers. Again, almost half of the state's labor force growth between over this past decade has been foreign-born workers, which tend to have a younger age profile, like a larger percentage of the population that's between 16 and 34 years of age, but also tend to have higher labor force participation rates as well. So what else do we see moving forward? Public school enrollments are a good indicator of the future workforce, because these are students who are in school now, but within the next decade are going to be graduating from high school and then either entering the workforce or attending college. Public school enrollments have been growing slowly over the past decade. So in greater Minnesota, they're up about 0.1% over the past decade. But we've also seen rapid growth there in students of other races. So in greater Minnesota, the student population is a little less racially diverse than in the Twin Cities metro area, but the significant increase, almost a 50% increase in students of other races between 2014 and 2024. And if you look here, this actually breaks it down by grade level. You can see that the younger grades, so kindergarten through 5th grade, tend to be more racially diverse than some of the older age or some of the older grades. What's been interesting too is because of this economic opportunity that's presented so many more vacancies than available seekers, we've actually seen a pretty significant shift in what students decide to do after high school. Right now, about 58% of high school graduates go directly to college. That's down from about 68% just in 2017. So like less than a decade ago, almost 70% of students, high school students in Minnesota, were going directly to college. Now a little less than 60% are going directly to college. There's also been some shifts in the post-secondary institutions that they decide to attend. A higher percentage are looking at schools outside of Minnesota. And then it also has some details there about the breakdown between 4-year versus 2-year, and then also public versus private. All of those can be great opportunities, and Minnesota is well known as a state that has high educational attainment. I apologize that I'm moving through this so quickly. Again, this is kind of scratching the surface. You can reach out if you have additional questions, but I know I have a tight time frame here. So the last thing that I want to talk about quickly is job vacancies in Minnesota. So again, the JOLT survey, which is done on a monthly basis, shows about 169,000 job openings in Minnesota in May. While that's down from the peak that it was seeing during the pandemic recession, because it was extremely hard to find workers at that time, it is still an elevated and historically high rate for the state of Minnesota. It's higher than it was pre-pandemic. We also do a separate survey called the Job Vacancy Survey on an annual basis within the state. And so we just released information for the full year of 2023. And we estimated about 139,000 vacancies in the state, which means that there was less than one job seeker for every vacancy that was available in the state. The industries that saw the highest demand Healthcare and social assistance had a huge amount of demand. Retail, trade, accommodation, and food services, both of those industries have been bouncing back. Manufacturing actually had a record number of vacancies in the 2022 job vacancy survey and has come back, but is still at historically high levels. And if you look more specifically at the occupations that are in highest demand, we've got lots of openings for food prep and serving workers, sales and related positions, healthcare practitioners, which would include nurses and doctors and dentists and things like that. Healthcare support occupations, which would be like home health aides and personal care aides and certified nursing assistants. And then also a tremendous amount of demand for transportation and material moving workers, so truck drivers and couriers and messengers and things like that. All of this is important to understanding the context and trying to hire and find additional workers. DEED also publishes a tool called Cost of Living. We just updated it for 2023, so it includes the impact of inflation in a lot of these different areas. So food costs are up, childcare costs are up, housing costs are significantly up, transportation costs are up for certain family types, but down for others because the ability to work remotely. This data is available for all 87 counties in the state, plus economic development regions and planning regions. And you can also do it for different household sizes. So depending on the size, the household type of the workers that you're trying to attract, you can use this information to understand, you know, what's a basic needs cost of living for a worker in this scenario, and you know, try and adjust wages to make sure that you're paying workers the amount that would be required to meet a basic needs cost of living in the state of Minnesota or in the specific county or region that you're located in. With that, this includes our contact information. We have 5 regional analysts stationed across the state of Minnesota. So no matter where you're located, you have someone that is local and lives in that region and can answer questions and provide additional data for you. That can include labor force studies for your individual county or region, wage information for about 800 different occupations in the state, industry employment trends to see, you know, what places are growing or declining, job vacancy survey details like I was talking about a couple slides ago. We're happy to help. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. This is what we do for a living, and we want to be a resource for you. With that, I will hand it back, and I apologize if I went a little over on time.
No, you were great, fantastic information. Does anyone have any questions for Cameron at this time? I did have one.
Yes.
You brought up remote workers a little bit, and there's a lot of people who are working. Are those tracked in these employment numbers if they're based here in Minnesota or if their company is based in a different state?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated. Depending on the data set, they will be counted. Like the unemployment rate would include people who are remote workers, because it doesn't matter where your actual job is located. It just matters where your residence is located and whether or not you are working for pay during the reference period. Some of the other details that I didn't get into but could help with, like industry employment statistics, that would be based on the location of the establishment rather than the location of the worker. So, but Minnesota has a really high percentage of remote workers, and we've been a little bit higher than the US overall, especially coming out of the pandemic recession. So that is a big issue, and it'll continue to be a big issue moving forward.
I invite anyone else, if you have any comments otherwise or questions, otherwise feel free to drop them in the chat and we can always circle back at the end of the presentations. So next I would like to introduce Mike. Mike is a teacher at Forest Lake Area High School and the leader of the school's Career Launch Program, which talks about ways that, and he's going to talk about ways that schools are connecting with area businesses to get kids hands-on experiences in a lot of different career fields. The Career Launch Program that Mike runs is funded in part with grant dollars awarded from the Youth Skills Training Program in the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. And through that program, students gain real-world experience. So I will let Mike talk about that more and some of these solutions of how we can train the next generation into the workforce.
Well, I appreciate the introduction. It's good to see some familiar faces on here as well and be with my fellow Farm Bureau members to provide some information. So glad to be with you today. And I'm also appreciate that Cameron was able to provide that foundation, because really it's that data that we've been able to get from DEED that has helped serve as the basis and the foundation for a lot of the career pathway work that we've done. Cameron's right. We work with Tim, and I can speak firsthand that those regional analysts are extremely responsive, and we ask for information from them. And not only do I get the information I'm looking for, but usually Tim goes a step further and says, I think this is some other information that you're going to find helpful. And so I can use that data to provide it to my district administration and school board members as a basis for some of the decisions that we're making. And so, Cameron really mentioned the changes and the trends, and really only scratch the surface of the data that DEED has that helps us make some of these decisions. And so as we try to project out, it really helps us as a school system to be responsive to not only the current needs, but anticipate future needs as well. We want our students to be competitive and successful in the future labor market. And we want to design programming that is going to accomplish that. And so I'm grateful for the school district that I work for, that they really view that as part of their role, in society, which is to help students find their career interests. And it's not to say that a high school education is going to accomplish what they need training wise. But it certainly helps kids figure some things out maybe earlier and be more strategic in the decisions that they make as they go through their decision-making processes. Cameron mentioned as well, there's fewer and fewer students going to post-secondary education right away. I don't think that that's necessarily means that they're not continuing to receive additional training beyond high school, but how they're receiving that training is different. We hear a lot about the cost of education going up. I think my students, because of the placements that they're having, and I'll share some of that as we go, they're finding a different avenue to finance their education. When I went to school to be a teacher, I needed a 4-year degree to become a teacher, and I had to go the scholarship and financial aid route, where a lot of students are going, especially in the industries of healthcare and manufacturing, that Cameron mentioned the tremendous need that exists and will continue to exist. Employers are willing to hire students now, give them some entry-level experience. And if it turns out that that's what that student ultimately wants to do, in a lot of situations, they're willing to provide them with the training or financial assistance necessary to continue their education. So all of those are ways, or creative ways, to help young people contribute to the workforce in a more immediate way, I guess I would say, and also reduce their post-secondary debt and continue to advance their skill set. So it's a new, I think it's a new avenue to post-secondary education that I'm seeing some of my students pursue, that's hopefully going to give them some longevity as they enter the workforce and their long-term careers. I'm going to put a link in the chat, and I'm going to share a web page with you. I think here that's going to just give you a quick overview of some of our programming that we offer through Career Launch. And so as I mentioned some of this, and hopefully that screen is coming through. If it's not, somebody let me know. But as I mentioned, Forest Lake Area School still provides a comprehensive high school experience. And certainly there's a whole host of academic and state mandated graduation requirements that we still have to provide. And that is our basic function. And that is the basic function of most high schools across the state. But fortunately, we have a lot of career and technical education programs that were already in place before I started in the role that I'm in, and before before we received some grant funding to help support the work. But that we really look to provide students with some career exploration. That's about our career exploration days, where we welcome industry partners, usually over 80 twice a year, that provides some real world exposure for all of our students about what careers locally are available to them now and into the future. We use a platform, a software called Zello. Zello is able to provide students with some career exploration planning that they're able to do to look at some careers of interest and start to look at some of those outlooks early on. But has been most meaningful is our career pathways guide. And so I'm just going to give you, since I'm with Farm Bureau here today, I'm going to give you the agriculture example. If I can grab that, the window here, there we go. But the career pathways guide is something that my colleague has put together that takes the career pathways that DEED and other state institutions use and organize the courses that we offer at Forest Lake Area High School into those pathways. Some of those are offered through our agriculture, food, and natural resources curriculum, but there are some courses that might be offered in the science department or the business department, wherever they meet, wherever they are. So as families try to navigate all of the courses that we have available to students, that can sometimes become overwhelming. And so now, instead of just listing a course guide by department, which is normally what a lot of schools do, and quite frankly, it's what we used to do, we now lay it out based on career pathways. So as students start to do things like Career Exploration Day, as they start to use Zello, they're then able to identify those career pathways and start to select courses in areas that might interest them. So we never track kids and say, you need to be in the ag pathway. We never tell them to quit exploring, especially at the high school level. But we hope that they start to become a little bit more deliberate in the choices that they make and take advantage of the free education that we're offering them in the public school to be more informed. We also, if you'll notice here, have a variety of courses that either have this C or this U next to them. The U means that course has some type of concurrent college credit. So while students are taking that course, they're already receiving college credit along with it. So they're getting their high school credit and they're getting their college credit at the same time. And the C indicates some type of industry recognized certification. So if I think healthcare, we offer a certified nursing assistant program or an EMT program that allows students to maybe transition to entry-level work after high school, since they've already earned that certification with not a lot of additional training. And then as they decide, maybe in that healthcare pathway, that they want to be a registered nurse, they're able to work, gain experience, and we call that stackable credentials. So they're able to keep progressing even as after they leave us into some of those different skilled areas. And so finally, as Rachel introduced, we talked about the Youth Skills Training Program, and that really helped us manage some internships, which is what I supervise. So we have a work-based learning program. A lot of schools have work-based learning programs where students actually go out and work. Ours is a little bit different in the sense that we want to be intentional about not necessarily where our students working now, but where do they want to be? And then I help facilitate those types of partnerships. So whether it's Midwest Machinery, which is an agricultural machinery vendor, implement vendor that we have in our community, or it's the local vet hospital, or in some other areas like manufacturing or cooperative. Students can come to me with their interest areas, and we can structure an internship where they're able to be released from school. They're able to go to work. They're able to earn high school credit while they're there, as well as earn a paycheck at the same time. So it helps meet some employment needs that might exist within our local community. But more importantly, I think it gives those employers access to some of our high school talent much earlier than they otherwise would be able to. And if it's a good fit, it might become long-term employment for that student after they graduate from high school, and a place where they'll continue to be trained, and maybe a place that will invest in their continuing education and training as well. So not that there aren't needs, and as Cameron mentioned, in retail or hospitality or food service, this is really taking a look at the students' long-term interest and trying to match them up with a business that has that same interest and that same intent in mind. So it's really a progression, I guess, as I summarize it. Again, we've used deeds data to help structure our programs and our pathways, and we provide that information to students and families. But then after that, and we allow that exploration phase to happen. And after they've done some deliberate course taking, we hope to structure internships for students who are interested to dive deeper and to go a step further than what we're able to provide at the high school, and actually get them out in the world of work. And so that's a little bit about what we're doing in Forest Lake. Glad to turn it back over to the facilitators, and happy to answer any questions if they come up through our conversation.
Great, thank you, Mike. I'll open up the floor. If anybody has any questions, feel free to just jump in. I know we did have one in the chat, and Cameron, you kind of touched on it. The question was, when you reference immigrant workforce, does that include those working on temporary work visas such as H-2A? And are you able to break down labor force trends by industry such as agriculture? So you gave the responses in the chat where people can find that information, but I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate on that at all.
No, so there's lots of different sources of data, and we'll try and find the best one to answer your individual question. So this is another case where there might be multiple sources of data, or certainly there would be an undercount in this area, because just by the nature of it being a temporary visa, they probably aren't getting included in the American Community Survey. That's usually sent out to residents in a certain area. So that number might be larger during certain periods. And Deed does have a migrant seasonal farm worker program, which we could certainly get you into contact with if you had any questions specifically about that.
Mhm.
Are there any other questions out there? Mike, one for you. How would you recommend, as we're looking towards finding solutions and working towards this, how can people on this call or farm bureaus or other organizations connect with their local high schools or other programs to get connected to students and tap into that next generation of the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is trying to identify a little bit about what your high school already offers. A lot of schools are trying to adjust, and quite frankly, the state is providing some grant dollars and different incentives to try to make that happen. And so, like I said, on that website, you can certainly use some of what we're doing as an example if you think that might be helpful to your schools as they build it. But I think being a resource, I think as a community leader, helping administrators understand why this is important. And again, I mentioned the value of the deed data to help explain some of that. Schools are vital to the success of our local communities, and this is just another way for schools to address some of those needs and challenges. And so I think helping explain that is important, but also helping connect schools with people and programs. You know, Cameron mentioned the deed folks. That's a good starting place, as well as the folks at the Department of Labor and Industry.
Feel free to jump in again if you have any questions.
So throughout our whole Harvesting Solutions series that we've been having this summer, it's been a very evident and common reoccurrence that the strength of our rural communities depends on the people that are living in these communities and contributing to those areas. And so I don't know if either of you would have any insight on recruiting and retaining people to live in Greater Minnesota, or what are ways that we can strengthen these communities and get workers to want to live in these areas?
I don't care.
Well, I certainly don't live, I guess, in Greater Minnesota, but what I will say is, I'm working in my home community. I'm working in the school that I graduated from. And so, as I tell folks, I think there are lots of great jobs and opportunities right in our own right in our own area. We don't need, certainly if somebody wants to move or do something different, we support that as well, but that doesn't have to be the case. And I think the same situation is true in Greater Minnesota. It's just I think mostly it's about creating more exposure so people actually know what exists. And the other thing I will say too, and being a teacher, I work with students, but I work with their parents a lot as well. And people have I don't, antiquated maybe isn't the right term, but manufacturing, agriculture, these industries, they look a lot different than what they did 20 years ago. And so helping parents understand with the help of some of that deed data that there are good jobs, high paying jobs, high skilled jobs available in these industries in our local communities. I think parents want their kids to be prosperous, right? And so helping them understand that is a path in Greater Minnesota is helpful in that conversation.
Yeah, Mike is exactly right. So if you can believe it, they actually let us go out and speak to student groups. So I'm sure Tim has probably come in and speak at his school, but we do the same thing across the state. There's an event called the Southwest Minnesota Career Expo that's held in both Marshall and Worthington, and we get like 2,000 high school students to come in, and we get to share this career information with them. And during that process, we also will do some like online polling where we'll ask the kids to take their phones out and respond to different questions that we have. And we'll ask them questions about, you know, where do you want to live after you grow up? You know, what do you want to do with your life? And to Mike's point, there are so many kids who they just aren't exposed to the amazing opportunities that they have available close to home. They just don't know what exists in those buildings that they drive by every day. And so there's absolutely opportunities to help open up their eyes. We talk during those presentations, you know, we'll say, go out and see the world. There's, you know, amazing stuff that's happening out there. But as you get older, if you decide you like the pace of living that you have, if you want to be close to your family, if you like the quality of life that you're able to achieve in Greater Minnesota, please come back. Like, we would love to have you. We've got open jobs and open arms, just, you know, come back. And so sharing that message, I think, is a little bit, it feels like counterculture, you know, like there's always this idea, you know, you gotta go somewhere else to be successful. That just isn't the case. And the more that we can share that with students when they're planning for their careers, the better off we'll all be. There's also a lot of other resources. You know, there's a lot of different groups that are working in that area to recruit and retain. So regional development commissions, you can reach out and work with them. Local workforce development boards, reach out to your regional analyst. They can plug you into different groups that are doing this type of thing. Chambers of commerce, a lot of the school districts, if they're working through a service co-op, you know, they're meeting regularly and sharing information. And, you know, the more unified that we can be, we're all kind of pulling in the same direction, but what if we were all on the same wagon together? We might have more success. So the opportunity is out there. We just have to figure out how to really make the most of it.
And along those lines, have you seen a shift in how companies are recruiting potential employees? And another question is, have you seen a lot of job jumping? Like you said, there's a uneven balance in the number of jobs available, and the number of employable people. So are you seeing a lot of people being able to jump more, as they find better opportunities or something else that might appeal to them?
Yeah, for sure. Job switching was a little bit more lucrative coming right out of the pandemic recession. Wages were higher for people who were switching from one company or one industry to another industry. That maybe has slowed down a little bit now. We've definitely seen employers reacting to this shift. And with the time frame that we had available, it was like condensed thoughts, but we could probably spend 8 hours talking about this shift from why students are going from high school into the workforce versus to college, because a lot of people are doing both, and both ways can be a path to success. But employers, when the applicant pool shrinks, what they tend to do is to change required qualifications to open it up to a larger group of people. So jobs that 10 years ago, as we're coming out of the Great Recession, back then we probably had 8 applicants for every job vacancy in the state. Now it's less than 1 for every job vacancy in the state. And so in order to cast a wider net, employers are saying, well, maybe we don't need a college degree in order to get this specific job. We can train them once they come and show up and start working for us. So, and that is consistent across all recessionary periods. That's how employers react. If we were to go the opposite direction, and which we are not currently, but if the labor market loosened a little bit and there were more people being laid off, then what you'd probably see employers do is to start raising qualifications again, because instead of trying to ferret through 100 applications, they can just say, well, let's just take these 10 because they all have college degrees, and we know that would be helpful in this job. So you absolutely see both job seekers and employers shifting to economic conditions that they're facing.
Any other questions out there?
I don't necessarily have a question, but I really appreciate the information that you both provided. It's great to see all of the statistics and facts in a consumable way, so that it's easy to take in instead of looking through a website and not absorbing the information. So I appreciate both of you being here today and kind of clearing up things that I maybe had assumptions of before, of why universities are seeing certain trends or why we're seeing trends in employees or anything like that in multiple different ways. So thank you so much for providing this information today.
Good information.
Yes, great. I'll echo that. Thank you, Cameron and Mike, for joining us, and you provided some great information. Then hopefully all of you in attendance have taken something away or thought of ways that you can kind of take action, or your county farm bureau can connect with your local school or other organizations to take action on this and get involved in connecting the workforce to the many opportunities that are available in agriculture. So this will be the end of our meeting. Just let you know that the recording will be available soon on our website and our YouTube channel. And you can also go back and watch our previous 2 sessions, which again were on childcare and healthcare. So thank you all for attending today, and I hope you have a great day.